So my name is Jonathan Silver. It's a pleasure to be with all of you and to have you here. This series on Torah Jews in America is designed to help us think a little bit as a religious community about the issues facing America, how we might reason together about them. And I thought, just to begin, that that's a profoundly democratic thing to do. So I hope you'll take tonight as an exercise, as a civic exercise, that helps us see the trade-offs in American public life a little bit more clearly. If you've not yet met Dr. Ryan Anderson or Professor Daniel Mark, our panelists, you'll get to see two great leaders with two great minds, but each one uniquely disciplined by the arts of civility. More about each of them in due course. But tonight we're going to discuss religious freedom in America. So I thought I'd just begin with some context. The Jewish immigrants who made a new home in America throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries came predominantly from Central and Eastern Europe, and they carried on their backs deep historical memories of religious persecution, and especially religious persecution carried out or authorized by government. So when the new Jewish Americans arrived on these shores, they thought, I think reasonably, they thought that a secular government, lacking distinct religious purposes, would leave them alone. Secular politics would be less likely to metastasize into anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is the reason they came here in the first place. It made sense. And in the New World, in the United States, there is a distinguished Jeffersonian tradition that sees the American constitutional order as a body of laws walled off from the church. Of course, the First Amendment to the Constitution does prohibit Congress from legislating religious establishment, and it prohibits Congress from interfering in religious exercise. But the distinguished Jeffersonian tradition I'm talking about goes beyond these concerns about establishment and exercise and dreams of a government freed from religious influence at all. That dream sounded pretty good to the Jewish immigrants who, for many years, had been hardened by state-sanctioned persecution. And the Jeffersonian dream of religion and state was so enthusiastically accepted by these American Jews, I think, because it addressed the old world fears that still gripped them. Now, over time, anxious to demonstrate their Americanness, anxious to be truly at home in their new country, most Jewish Americans, even and especially those Jewish Americans who grew a little less religious over time, eventually embraced parts of this Jeffersonian constitutional tradition, even as they forgot the Jewish history that made it reasonable for their great-grandparents. For many years now, Jewish Americans have been at the forefront of keeping the wall of separation between religion and state high. But does that position really serve the Jewish interests of America? Does it serve American interests? How should the Jewish community think about religion and state? First, we're going to hear from Dr. Ryan Anderson, the William E. Simon Fellow at the Heritage Foundation, editor of the online journal Public Discourse, co-author of the seminal book, What is Marriage, author of a brand new book from Oxford University Press, I think just a few weeks out, debating religious liberty and discrimination. Maybe he'll tell us more about that. Ryan will give us an overview tonight of the religious liberty debate in America today, help us see what's changed, the key sides of the argument on different sides, what's at stake in the current moment. He'll also share with us some of what our Christian friends are thinking about and doing. We'll then hear from Professor Daniel Mark, professor of political science at Villanova University, where he teaches political theory, philosophy of law, the American government. Professor Mark serves on the 9-member bipartisan United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. It's a mouthful. Appointed to that position by then House Speaker John Boehner. I'll ask Daniel to explore the current debate as it relates to the Jewish community in particular, looking back a bit at what religious freedom has meant to us as a community, and then more concretely about how changes in religious freedom might affect our institutions and what Jewish leaders should do about it. I'll ask each of them to speak for a few minutes. We'll have a short conversation and then open it up for Q&A. Dr. Anderson.
Great, thank you. And thank you all for coming. Thank you for inviting me. We each have kind of like 20 minutes to make a short opening presentation before getting to your questions. And so in the time I have, I want to talk a little bit about where the flashpoints are for religious liberty in the U.S. context, particularly for Christian communities. I'm not Jewish. I'm here to kind of represent a Christian perspective. I don't think there's anything known as the Christian perspective. So it's a Christian perspective. And so I want to talk about a couple of the flashpoints, what's going on, and then I want to step back and give an analysis of why are we seeing these conflicts today, because many of these conflicts are new in American history from the Christian perspective. I'm Catholic as well, so Catholics are somewhat used to this because there's a shameful history of anti-Catholicism that we experienced in prior generations. But for the past 50 years, both Catholics and Protestants thought they were at home and comfortable in the United States. And then something within the past 5 to 10 years has forced Christian believers in the U.S. to reconsider some of those claims. So I want to start with what some of those flashpoints are, how we arrived here, and then what Christians or some Christians are doing about it. So I want to start with some charities. What we saw 10 years ago in Massachusetts was that Catholic charity adoption agencies were forced to stop providing their services to orphans because they wanted to find homes for orphans with married moms and dads. And the state of Massachusetts said that's illegal, unlawful discrimination because we now have marriage equality in Massachusetts. And unless you treat same-sex moms and same-sex dads and dads the same way as you treat married moms and dads, you're discriminating on the basis of sexual orientation, which is unlawful in Massachusetts. As part of their anti-discrimination statutes, they include sexual orientation as a protected class like race or sex. And so as a result, the Catholic Church, which is under a biblical mandate to take care of widows and orphans and has been doing that for longer than the state of Massachusetts has existed, can no longer do that work in the state of Massachusetts and in Illinois and in San Francisco and in Washington, D.C., where I live. Sometimes it's been because of licensing. The state said we wouldn't give you a license to run an adoption agency unless you agree to place children with same-sex married couples on an equal basis as married moms and dads. Sometimes it was simply a matter of contracts. They were no longer eligible for contracting with the government for child social services. Children become wards of the state when they're orphaned. And so if you're ineligible for the contract, it more or less means you're not going to be able to do this sort of work. I have two thoughts about these particular cases. One is that I don't think it's discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. The argument here is not that gay and lesbian people are bad people and therefore they shouldn't adopt kids. The argument that the Catholic Church and various other communities make is that men and women are different, and the two best dads in the world can't replace a missing mom. The two best moms in the world can't replace a missing dad. Mothers and fathers aren't interchangeable, and therefore we should do what we can to find a child, both a mom and a dad. Now, you can agree with Catholics or disagree with Catholics on that question, but whatever it is, it has nothing to do with sexual orientation. It's just a separate animal. They're not saying anything about the sexual desires, the sexual attractions, the sexual actions that prospective parents may or may not engage in. They're talking about how mothering and fathering look different at a practical level and how children deserve both. And so they can't do that any longer under a non-discrimination statute. The second thought I have about this is, who does it actually benefit? Religious liberty is actually good. It's a force for good in the United States because we want more religious institutions serving more groups of vulnerable people in accordance with their own identity. I want Jewish charities to be authentically Jewish. I want Catholic charities to be authentically Catholic, evangelical services to be authentically evangelical, so that more people can be served. If you've ever been to the DMV, you know what government bureaucracies can be like. So imagine what the DMV of adoption agencies is like. And there might be a reason why someone would prefer to go to a Catholic adoption agency. If you're a mother facing an unplanned pregnancy, knowing that you can go to a Catholic agency to place your child up for adoption might make the process go a little bit easier for you. If you're a prospective family, being able to adopt the child through a religious agency, adopting a child is not like renewing your driver's license. They're not just material needs, they're spiritual needs, emotional needs. A Catholic agency can minister to the whole family. So it's not surprising that Catholic Charities in Boston had the best track record of placing the hardest to place kids in adoptive homes. Lots of people want to adopt newborn babies. They're cute and they're cuddly. Not as many people want to adopt 10-year-old boys with behavioral problems who bounced from foster home to foster home to foster home. And Catholic Charities chalk this up either to grace or to Catholic guilt. But one way or the other, they got more families to open up more hearts and more homes to more children. Why would we want to say they can no longer do that? So religious liberty here, it protects pluralism and diversity, but it also protects vulnerable populations, mothers facing unplanned pregnancies, children who need to be adopted, and the Catholic Church can't do that work in various jurisdictions. I could give you another example about surgery for transgender patients, but we don't have time, so I'll just mention the ACLU is currently suing 2 Catholic hospitals because they declined to remove the uterus of a woman who wanted to become a man. And again, I don't think this is discrimination on the basis of gender identity. The Church's position is we don't remove healthy uteruses from people regardless of how they identify. If you're a woman who identifies as a woman or a woman who identifies as a man, we're not going to remove your uterus if it's not medically indicated. And they don't think sex reassignment surgery is the proper medical treatment for gender dysphoria. Again, you can agree or disagree about this, but it's not discrimination on the basis of gender identity. What would that look like? If they said, we won't do your chemotherapy because you're gay or lesbian or transgender, that would be discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. But to say that when there's a controversial medical procedure at stake, which there is no medical or scientific consensus as to what effective therapies look like, it simply smuggles in the conclusion, which is to say in this case that Catholic hospitals can't practice medicine according to their convictions. So that's the charitable context. Then there's an educational context, and I imagine Danielle might say something about this, and this might be even more relevant to this audience, is that a variety of ways in which Christian schools have been under pressure because of their beliefs and their practices with regards to human sexuality. So Gordon College, an evangelical school up in Massachusetts, was under investigation for a year because it has a campus policy that expects chastity of all members. What they mean by that is marriage is between a man and a woman, sex is reserved for marriage, so they don't want any sexual activity outside of marriage. And the argument of the accrediting agency was, well, this is anti-gay because you're saying your gay students can't get married and therefore they can't have sex, and so this is being unfairly applied. They spent a year being investigated by the accrediting agency, and the end result was the accrediting agency said, at this time, we find no reason to revoke their accreditation. BYU, the Mormon law school in Utah, they were investigated by the American Bar Association because they have a similar policy. During oral arguments at the Supreme Court in Obergefell, the Supreme Court case about the redefinition or the definition of marriage that resulted in the redefinition of marriage, Justice Alito asked Solicitor General, what's going to happen to Christian schools that teach that marriage is the union of a man and a woman? And I think you can directly apply this to what will happen to Jewish schools that teach that marriage is the union of a man and a woman. And Alito compared it to the Bob Jones University case. Here you had a case of an evangelical college that had a campus policy against interracial dating. And Alito said, and they lost their nonprofit tax status. They appealed to the US Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, no, you lose. The IRS can revoke a nonprofit tax status when it undercuts, the organization undercuts a stated public policy purpose like racial equality. And so Alito's question was, will the same thing now happen to Orthodox Jews, Roman Catholics, evangelicals, Latter-day Saints, various people of faith who believe marriage unites man and woman, husband and wife? And the response was chilling. The Solicitor General said, I don't deny it, Justice Alito, that's going to be an issue. I don't deny it, it's going to be an issue. And then the day after the Obergefell decision came down, the religion columnist for the New York Times wrote an op-ed in Time magazine titled, Now's the Time to End Tax-Exempt Status for Religious Schools. So just imagine what happens here. If you were to lose, your religious school loses its nonprofit tax status. 1/3 of your budget would go to Uncle Sam. You'd have to start paying corporate income taxes, and right now they're about 33, 35%. While simultaneously your donations would go down because your donors no longer get a tax write-off for donating to you. So you would see your revenue shrink as your expenses go up by about 1/3. It would be crippling for many religious institutions, especially in urban areas, if you have to start paying property taxes in addition to corporate income tax. And property taxes are done at a local level, but if you lose your 501c3, there are then ramifications in the property level. What happens if you lose your accreditation? It's hard to go to a law school if you don't have a 4-year accredited undergraduate college degree. You can't sit for the bar if you don't attend an ABA accredited law school. So there are various ways in which accreditation matters. And then there's all the funding issues. I haven't even mentioned funding, but the vast majority of schools, I think it's all but 5 four-year colleges in the United States, receive federal funding of some sort. A subsidized student loan, funding from the government for fundamental science research, for laboratories, for things like that. And all of that could be denied to schools that have the wrong beliefs about marriage. The last thing I'll mention are professionals. And we've seen the professionals, the baker, the florist, the photographer, but then also the Green family, the owners of Hobby Lobby. And in this case, the Little Sisters of the Poor. And I'll mention all of these in the same breath to say, here you have people of faith who are doing something that's deemed not religious enough, either because they're running a for-profit business, the baker, the florist, the photographer, the owners of Hobby Lobby, the Green family, or in the case of Little Sisters of the Poor, they're taking care of the elderly. And in both cases, the government was saying you have to do something that these religious individuals said we can't. The Greens said we can't provide health insurance that covers 4 drugs that have an FDA label that says it can cause abortion. The Little Sisters of the Poor said we can't do it if it's contraceptives. So the Greens are evangelicals, they're against abortion but not contraception. The nuns are Catholic, they're against both. And then the baker, the florist, the photographer, same-sex weddings. They had no problem, and I'll give one example of the baker, of the florist. She's employed gay people in her floral studio. She's had gay employees. She was serving the particular gay couple that sued her for a decade, doing happy birthday flowers, get well soon flowers. Her only objection was to same-sex wedding flowers. And she said, I can't use my God-given artistic gifts and talents to help celebrate what I think violates God's plan for marriage. And again, you can agree or disagree with that evangelical florist's beliefs about marriage. What's the government's justification in saying she has to do the wedding flowers, or that Hobby Lobby has to provide the insurance coverage for contraception or abortion? It strikes me here that, again, we want to have the market sort these things. That if you want to bake the gay wedding cake, you're free to do it. If you don't want to bake the gay wedding cake, you don't have to do it. And then Yelp reviews and various other non-governmental responses will sort this out. People will be able to select which baker, which florist to use. And people might lose business over this. Same thing with schools. If you want to go to an authentically Christian college, you'll know that somewhere like Wheaton College or University of Notre Dame might be for you. If you don't want to go there, go to Princeton, go to Yale, go to Harvard. Let the competition work. Go to yeshiva if you want an authentically Jewish experience. Go somewhere else if you want a different experience. It just strikes me that, again, religious liberty serves diversity, but it also then serves the outputs, and that you get a different education at these different institutions. And we should let professors, parents, students decide. So the challenge is, I'll mention 3 historical changes, and the answer is going to be respond to all 3. First is, there's been a change in the nature of religion in the United States. I think the weakening of mainline Protestant churches. I used to work at the magazine First Things, and Father Newhouse said the mainline became the sideline. You could think about here, they became the old line, and now they're the sideline. Mainline Protestant churches don't have the vitality that they once had in the United States. Episcopalians, Presbyterians, Lutherans, it's now evangelicals and Catholics, by and large, are the vital centers of religion. And so there's been a change there. And then Catholics, as a result of the Second Vatican Council, there was a liberalizing spirit in religion. And so to a certain extent, there's been a change inside of American Christianity, a liberalizing effect. And then there was also a change outside of religion with secularism. So it left what Father Newhouse called the naked public square. Religion is relevant inside the 4 walls of your church or inside of your synagogue, but it's not relevant in the public square, Main Street, Wall Street, in your business. So that's one change. Second change, the growth of the government. If James Madison or Thomas Jefferson came back today and heard about the Little Sisters of the Poor lawsuit, the response wouldn't be the First Amendment. The response would be, what is the Department of Health and Human Services, and what authorizes them to mandate that the nuns provide these things? Right? So the best protection of religious liberty was limited government in the first place. And so as government grew, greater likelihood of challenges. And then the last change is a sexual revolution. So it's not surprising that the flashpoints deal with contraception, abortion, marriage, gender identity. The ACLU likes religious liberty, when it's the Amish using a red reflective triangle instead of brake lights on their buggy, or when it's the Muslim inmate who grows a short beard inside of jail, or when it's Jewish inmates who get kosher meals. ACLU is okay with that. The ACLU is not okay when it's Hobby Lobby or the Little Sisters or the baker, the florist, the photographers, or the hospitals that won't do sex reassignment surgeries. So I think the response is, and then I'll wrap up on this, is we have to respond on the religious front by revitalizing our own religious communities. One of the best protections for religious liberty is vital religious communities. We protect the liberties that we exercise, and so we need a revitalization of religions, a variety of religions. Second is to limit government. Government is less likely to violate your religious liberty if it's doing less. And that's one of the liberties hang or fall together. And then lastly, it's to respond to the sexual revolution. And I think this will be an intergenerational response. But the starting point is to say that the convictions that Orthodox Jews and Orthodox Christians live by are true. I actually think we have to start saying, look, it's not just we want the private right to believe nonsense and to kind of be like bigots in the privacy of our institutions. It's that we believe that what we believe, what's been revealed to us about the human body and human sexuality is true. And so we're asking for the right to be free to live in accordance with the truth. And so I think we also have to respond on the sexual part. So with that, that's kind of a perspective from a Christian. And then I'll let Danielle say a perspective from a Jew. And my understanding is that if there are two Jews in a room, you'll get three perspectives. That's what I've been told as a Christian. So I'm expecting like a perspective and a half from Danielle.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Ryan, and thank you, John. So I think to start with the context and what religious liberty has meant in America is really to start where John put us, which is how good the Jews have it in America and how good the Jews always have had it in America. Of course, there is a history of discrimination in the United States. As far as the discrimination Jews have experienced in history, this one was pretty tame. But really, there's an excellent tradition going all the way back. One of the most famous, and anyone who's participated in any Tikvah program before already knows this. It's Washington's letter to the Newport Jews, where they kind of, congratulations on being president and thank you for the tolerance. And Washington went back and said, we don't speak of tolerance in America. This isn't, one group at its pleasure, kind of allowing some other group to exist and to practice, but it's rather, that the equality of all citizens and the freedom to practice as they see fit. And Washington says it better, so look it up. It's only one page. But really, I think the first place to start is to acknowledge the unbelievable experience of religious freedom that Jews have had in America. I'm particularly mindful of this because, as you heard, I do some work on international religious freedom. And in fact, I was in about a month ago. I was in Pakistan, just as one example, and it's a pretty bad place. And every time I see a place like that, or just in the kind of day-to-day following of the situation around the world, I'm reminded, of course, how blessed we are to have the situation we have in America. And yet, I want to start by saying that that contrast probably has the opposite effect of what you would think. It does not make me at all complacent about the situation in the United States, or perhaps we might say in the West more generally. On the contrary, it reminds me each day how vigilant we need to be to protect the extremely precious religious liberty we have here. And it is a constant reminder of how delicate, how fragile the conditions are that allow us to have it. Now, it doesn't mean it'll all be gone tomorrow, but it is the kind of thing that we have to work very, very hard to protect. I think we have to recognize that we should not take anything for granted. That situation can change, and in some ways, we already see changes. Obviously, the experience, the West generally, of course, is a good place for Jews in the contemporary world in terms of the laws surrounding religious freedom. But we also know that there's a difference between America and Europe in a number of ways. And I don't think that we should look at that too smugly and say, well, America is one way and Europe is another way. I think we see think we could, if we had the time, go through other examples of the way in which Europe is just a few years, a generation ahead of the United States in terms of social and economic changes. It's kind of like they're running the experiment for us. And again, I think there are several examples of that. And being mindful of changes that are happening in Europe, I think we should keep in mind the situation here and how that can change as well. Now, the problem, as Ryan already put out very well, is widespread. And the main message I have about that in the Jewish context is that the Jewish community, the Frum community, needs to be much more mindful of the fact that this is a real and growing challenge to religious communities, including the Jewish community. Obviously, and I don't say this with any judgment, more liberal branches of Judaism simply won't face the same conflicts in the same way, because obviously institutions that, for example, accept same-sex marriage, as Orthodoxy doesn't, but as other denominations do, just simply won't run into the same problems. That won't cover everything. But I think, in my experience, Orthodox Jews, the Frum community tends to be less engaged in social issues than in other political issues. And there are a lot of understandable reasons for that. In my judgment, it's a mistake nonetheless, but there are understandable reasons. But I think one result of this and of other factors is that our heads aren't enough in the game in terms of these types of challenges and what the Frum community will potentially face as all the challenges that Ryan mentioned come to bear. And that's very easy for me to describe because for the most part you can just plug in everything Ryan said into the Jewish context. But before I get to those, let me just point out, and this is something that does reach more widely and that we've seen on a different scale, is legal challenges, for example, to the Jewish practice of circumcision, bris milah, or kosher slaughter, shchita. This is more famous in Europe because of countries that have banned these practices on and off, depending on which country and which practice. Obviously, the German court case about circumcision is probably the most famous, but countries in Scandinavia that have passed laws against kosher slaughter and so on. And every once in a while, in some not so quiet hamlet of Northern California, we do see legal efforts to pass local ordinances against these kinds of practices. And we are fortunate to be in a time and a place where those practices, kosher slaughter, circumcision, have such widespread acceptance and support in the culture that it's very hard for those issues to get traction at a state or national level. But I don't think we should take for granted that would be the case forever. Nothing is the case forever in politics and in culture. And so those are some of the, I think, the most gripping examples that have a real history of actually seeing legislation or legislative efforts. And then beyond that, there's everything Ryan said in the Jewish context, the ability of clergy, including rabbis, to perform weddings is at stake. Right? The state may say, and there's a particular kind of working group, I guess, at Columbia Law School that had a draft document outlining a legal strategy to make it such that any clergyman or woman who wouldn't perform same-sex weddings shouldn't be allowed to be an agent of the state for any wedding. Now, again, this isn't a cataclysm coming, because at the end of the day, you can still go get a marriage license like you need, but it is a good example of the way religious agents would be increasingly marginalized from all these normal civil functions that are what seem like a settled part of our legal landscape. And then after that, of course, the case of doctors, including psychologists, by the way, this issue of what if we already know that this is the case with homosexuality, now with transgenderism or gender dysphoria, could a psychologist tell a person who identifies as the opposite sex, the problem is actually not in your body, in your biology, but in your mind, in your psychology, and let's treat you therapeutically that way instead of surgically. Will a psychologist be allowed to say that? Or will a psychologist lose his or her license? To say nothing of the surgeon, again, which Ryan raised. And then the big one, what I call the big one, which Ryan addressed as well, is tax-exempt status. There's a very direct and clear legal agenda. It follows the Bob Jones history exactly. It's just a straight application of what happened in the Bob Jones case. And the idea would be that any nonprofit that doesn't that doesn't recognize whatever it is, in this case same-sex marriage being the most obvious, could lose its tax-exempt status. Schools, shuls, are obviously at risk. Maybe it was a bad idea to get addicted to government money in the first place, but this is the situation we find ourselves in, and I think most of our institutions would be very hard-pressed to survive if they weren't receiving tax-exempt donations, like Ryan said, if they were paying property taxes and corporate taxes, so on and so forth. So that's the problem that we're facing. As far as the solutions, on the most practical level, and I'll say 2 words about this, because this is really what people need to do in the nuts and bolts, is taking concrete steps to prepare for the coming legal challenges. There are some religious liberty organizations like Alliance Defending Freedom, which focus particularly on religious liberty for Christians in the United States and around the world, as a matter of fact, with their international arm. But they have now templates that churches and schools can adopt into their bylaws that are the kinds of things that courts will recognize down the road when you say, well, we couldn't acknowledge this kind of relationship or this kind of situation, and it's a long-standing part of our beliefs and our policies, as opposed to kind of you're presented with this situation and now you have an ad hoc committee of the board that has to deal with this and make a decision, and then it's not that it isn't really rooted, but the court looks at that, it's like, no, somebody just showed up and you said, we don't really like that, we'll discriminate. And so there are concrete legal ways, I think, in which institutions need to prepare. But the much bigger picture here, again, very much, I think I spend a lot of time also listening to Ryan and learning from Ryan and reading Ryan's books, but I find myself, almost in every case in agreement with Ryan, so there's a lot of overlap here, but the bottom line is that politics and economics are downstream. Politics, economics, law, all these things are downstream from culture.
We disagree about Jesus.
So yes, we do. I was thinking that when you said it, I was like, I'll leave that for the Q&A. So someone was going to say, well, where do you disagree? I know that Ryan agrees with me that the political and legal battles that we're fighting are really just short-term skirmishes compared to the wider fight for the culture. In the long run, if the society is against us, no part of the Constitution is going to keep us safe. It doesn't matter whether for the courts, of course, God willing, we'll have many more good justices on the Supreme Court for the rest of our lives. But at the end of the day, the court has shown a willingness over the years to make the Constitution say anything it wants the Constitution to say. And so at the end of the day, you need the right elected officials and then the right appointees of the right elected officials, so on and so forth, down the road. And so it's the culture, first and foremost, that concerns us. And of course, when it comes to the culture, it isn't about amending bylaws of your school or your shul or anything else like that. And so I want to say 2 things, a kind of a twin mission in our cultural efforts as Jews. First, we need to promote religion. And second, these are not giving them priority by first and second, but just kind of a logical order. And second, we need to promote religious freedom. Those are 2 things, and they both need to be done. Now, what do I mean? Well, on promoting religion, if people don't value religion, then in the long run, I think they're not going to value religious freedom. I had the privilege of writing a very short introductory essay to Heritage, that's Ryan's outfit, the 2016 Heritage Index of Culture and Opportunity, if that's the right name, right? And the chapter that I introduced was a chapter on church attendance, and what it showed is declining church attendance in the United States. And part of what I said is that one of the worrying things about that, there's a lot of good things that religious people provide to the common good, but part of the concern is that as people become less religious, they will put less value in religious freedom. And I said, imagine, for example, if Americans didn't have, and God bless them, right, this fanatical commitment to the freedom of the press, right? If people the press does a lot of bad things. There's everything like from the salacious tabloid news that does nothing but degrade all the subjects and all the readers, and then there's like exposing national security secrets when they shouldn't be, right? Like at a far opposite extreme of press malfeasance. If that took hold enough that the American people just got utterly fed up with the press and lost the sense of value of the press, how long would freedom of the press last in America? How long would that hold up? And I think religion can face the same kind of problem. And second, we need to promote, of course, religious freedom. And here I really have to directly echo what Ryan said about needing a robust affirmative defense, an affirmative account of religious freedom and why it's good, and not just to resort to special pleading. We frequently, and I speak at myself here, fall into the trap of conceding the premise that we are weird or crazy or stupid or evil or something like that. And then we throw ourselves on the mercy of the court and say, but the Constitution and the First Amendment protects my right to be weird or crazy or stupid or evil. Well, that's not going to last. The Bob Jones example proves it in black and white terms that are unmistakable and undeniable, but also in our common culture. I mean, I saw a political cartoon. It was like a cute little girl in blonde pigtails or something like that, and saying something like, it's still bigotry if you call it religion or something. And this is, of course, surrounding the same-sex marriage debate. Right? At the end of the day, the law, our legal regime, does not really protect bigotry. I mean, there's some right to say and think what you want in private, but as soon as you interact in public, right, every business becomes a public accommodation, so on and so forth, and the game is lost. And I think Jews, this is a message for Jews, I think even more starkly than Christians, because we've kind of in a vague way relied on being a protected group. Where we kind of have this special victim status where we expect the court or the law to come out on our side. It's like a case about the Amish who didn't want to have their kids in school. Could their kids be exempt? And you read the Supreme Court decision, and part of it you feel like what the Supreme Court was saying is like, well, this isn't really a good idea in general, but the Amish are so cute. And so, right, and Jews, I think, don't really have that status anymore in American culture, and I certainly don't think they could count on having that much longer. And so if we don't make the general case, if we don't make a broader affirmative case for religious liberty just as such, this idea of like even, like, I don't want to be too good, but like, don't hurt us because of the Holocaust or something like that, just isn't going to work down the road. My special message for the Jews, or what I might title it, said like 2 things Jews don't get. And the first is the importance of what Tikvah has been calling for a long time in a lot of its programs, the Jewish citizen. There's 2 models of citizenship, a good one and a bad one, I'll put it starkly. One in which, one based on civic virtue and one based on special interests. The special interest model says we have a lot of political clout, we have a lot of leverage, and we need to use that leverage to get the biggest slice of the pie we can for ourselves. I think the Jewish funding for Jewish schools or something. There have been some articles written about these kinds of things, and that model is employed somewhat openly. Versus the civic virtue model that says the responsibility of a citizen in the public square is to promote the common good, and it's to vote for the common good and to contribute to the common good. And I think we need an account, and have an account of why religious freedom is for the common good. Not just that if you don't cater to the Jews, you won't get our votes in New York and Florida and Idaho or Ohio, or wherever they count. And we actually know this because when it comes to pro-Israel advocacy, everybody knows that you don't go to Capitol Hill on lobbying day and say, if you want Jewish votes and you want Jewish money, everybody understands that. But if you want Jewish votes, you want Jewish money, you better do right. It's an argument about how Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East and America's strongest ally, and how all the listings on the NASDAQ and tech and startup and trade and everything else like that. Right? We understand that the politically responsible and politically virtuous argument, and in the end, I hope also the most strategic one, is an argument about the common good that makes it clear to the country that this is for everyone. And of course, the subtext of this, which connects back to what I said before, is that religious freedom is not only good because it's necessary for a pluralistic, tolerant, and cooperative society, right, where people are okay to let other people be different and so on, but also because it's necessary for religion. If you don't have religious liberty, you won't have religion, or at least any of the minority religions like Judaism. And religion is good. Religion makes society better. This is where we come here with a message of a more excellent way, a truth that we want to live out, that we want to witness to the entire society. And the second thing, and what Jews don't get, is that Jews, and this is a much longer story, but I think that Jews have a special responsibility to promote religious freedom and other good things, not only because we Jews obviously rely critically on religious freedom in a non-Jewish society or in a non-religious society, perhaps in the case of Israel, but also because Jews have a special mission to enlighten society. It's part of what the mission of the Jewish people is. Again, longer story. David Novak, a frequent source of readings in Tikvah programs, says that all human rights come from Breshit, come from Genesis, from the idea that God created human beings in his image and likeness. Now, Ryan and I agree on a natural law account that can do human rights without religion. Nonetheless, David Novak has a lot of good things to say about that. I'll close with just a connection to a word of Torah here. It's homiletic, so you'll grant me the license. But there's a curious episode in Shemot in Exodus 5 where Moses comes to Pharaoh and says, "We'd like 3 days in the wilderness to worship our God, please." Right? And to us, the reader, it's a pretty ridiculous request, because we know, of course, that 3 days is not the plan, right? This isn't a 3-day prayer retreat in the woods. They're looking to be gone for good. And this is perhaps why in a later exchange, Pharaoh responds, well, the men can go leave the women and children, because then the men will have to come back for the women and children, so they can't escape. So it seems like, why is Moses lying or trying to trick him? And anyway, Pharaoh's obviously wise to the ruse, because he doesn't really want to let them go for 3 days. And so my homiletic understanding of this is that what the understanding that Moses and Pharaoh shared, which is why Moses asks for the 3 days, even though they want to go forever, and why Pharaoh says no, even though 3 days wouldn't mean anything to him, is that the idea that they could go worship the Lord in the wilderness would have established, just in the tiniest notion, the principle that the Israelites were not wholly the servants of the property of Pharaoh, but were the servants of, belonged wholly to God, first and foremost, above and beyond. And in that way, I think this is where in the pagan world, where the gods were the gods of the city. And so to violate the laws was not just treason, but sacrilege. And people in the Egyptian Empire and the Roman Empire, each individual was nothing but a cog in the wheel, was nothing but a dispensable and disposable piece of property of the empire. And then the God of Israel comes and says, no, every human being is created in my image and likeness and belongs to me. And the state plays a secondary and subsidiary role, that there is always something above. And so if religious freedom in this small and admittedly homiletic way is the first crack in the door, the first opening that says the state is not all and is not everything, but there's a power above and beyond, then I think that opens the door to the whole panoply of human rights that follow from this, because they are all those things that we possess prior to the state and before the state and above and beyond the state. And so I think that's part of the Jewish message and the Jewish understanding, and part of the Jewish responsibility to the world in protecting not just ourselves, but religious freedom for civilization.
So before we entertain questions, I thought I might take the liberty of asking both of you a question. Especially in the Christian community, there's a extremely fascinating debate which is happening right now among social conservatives, religious conservatives, who identify exactly the same problems that Ryan identifies and exactly the same problems that Danielle identifies, but come to almost the opposite conclusion. They come to conclude that the common culture, which is upstream of politics and law and economics, is so unfriendly at this moment to the biblical way of life that our communities embrace, that the task of revitalizing that culture with religious wisdom is beyond us. If we're going to be honest about it, it's beyond us. And instead, if we're responsible parents, what we should do is turn inward, raise up our children in communities of homogeneous purity, and hope that the culture takes care of itself. What's wrong with that argument?
So I'll take a stab at it. I have two thoughts, is that we need to do both. So the response I gave was, three-pronged. First, we have to revitalize religious communities, including our own, whichever one we belong to. And so that means if I have children, I need to form my children in the faith. I need to be attentive to my church community and do what I can to make it flourish. But that's not going to be a full-time job for me. I'm not a priest. I'm not a nun. I'm going to have a full-time job in the world. And I can do both of those things. I can be attentive to my children and their religious upbringing. I can be attentive to my church while also being a fellow at a think tank that tries to promote good public policy for the larger community. So that's why I think we need to be attentive to that first part, which is revitalizing our religious communities, forming our children. But then also the second part, limiting the government. Because I don't even think we're going to have the freedom to be attentive to our communities and our children if the government says it's unlawful bigotry. If they say that your homeschooling curriculum is not allowed, or your religious school is not allowed, or your house of worship will lose its various forms of nonprofit tax status. All of those things would make the first option impossible unless we engage on the second. So I don't have grand delusions that we're going to be successful in the short term. I think mainstream culture gets worse before it gets better. But I think it's our vocation, both as Jews and as Christians, to bring the light of truth to the larger culture. But we have to do that in a way that it doesn't go out in our own communities. But I don't think it's an either or. I think it needs to be a both and.
Well, this is one of those things that is a very heated debate, but where Ryan and I really are in agreement. And I will say, I guess the name that that John didn't say is the Benedict option. This is the title that's been given to this. Rod Dreher is the most famous exponent of it. Now finally has the book by the same name on the same subject. And so the first question that everybody has to ask is, well, what are you actually talking about when you propose this? And I would say we could maybe put out three positions, very stylized, but there's kind of the Haredi ultra-Orthodox position, the modern Orthodox position, and then what I'll call the contemporary Catholic position. And I'll explain what I mean by that in just a second. And so it depends which one you mean. The Haredi community, the ultra-Orthodox community, I think is the most extreme example. I mean, not speaking of the Amish and so on, of isolating and insulating themselves from keeping the communities as closed and insular as possible. Not perfectly, of course, but nothing is hermetically sealed in the modern world. But certainly, it's an extraordinary achievement, the degree of insularity that some ultra-Orthodox communities have achieved, even in New York. And then modern Orthodox, which is both in principle and in practice, much less insular, but still Jewish schools, Jewish camps, synagogues that are right there in the neighborhood because everyone's still living together, clustered around a synagogue because they're not driving to synagogue on Saturdays and so on. And then the contemporary Catholic, where the majority now are sending their kids to public school, and then just fill in, et cetera, for kind of all the parallel institutions, which is not right. But what Catholics were doing 50 years ago probably looks like what modern Orthodox Jews are doing now, but not today. And I think that's why you see much more traction, so either you kind of get, when you ask, well, what do you mean by the Benedict option? And then either someone says, oh, well, describe something that sounds like ultra-Orthodox, and then I'm against that for reasons that I'll say in a moment. Or they say something that sounds like modern Orthodoxy, in which case not only am I all for it, I'm already doing it and plan to keep doing it, and don't think it's problematic or very Benedictine, frankly. And so it depends what you mean, but I will just say, in terms of staking out my actual position here, is that first, strategically speaking, not going to work. They're coming for us, right? This is not right. If all our institutions, no matter how insular they are, lose their nonprofit status, right? That's a real blow. This isn't about, oh well, if we want to just cloister ourselves, and then again, just then fill in the blank for all the equivalent things. I mean, you could say, well, no one will work outside the community, but people, I mean, we're Jews, right? They're going to have to be doctors and lawyers and so on working outside the community, and then they're going to be faced with all of these challenges. So I just don't think that it's realistic. I will say also on that note that the so-called libertarian compromise is and always was a farce, right? The idea and the fight over the Religious Freedom Restoration Act in Indiana proved this more clearly than anything else, right? Well, gay marriage, same-sex unions, they don't affect anyone. Just, if you want to have one, have one. If you don't want to have one, don't have one. And then as soon as it came to try to, there are many in many states already, but to pass additional laws protecting people who don't want to be in one way or another bullied into or complicit in these kinds of arrangements, the other side was completely against any such legislation. Right? A pizza store had to be boycotted and threatened and everything else like that because in a hypothetical case, that owner didn't want to cater a same-sex wedding. It never even happened. Somebody just opportunistically walked in and said, "Would you?" And probably the answer is, since when do pizza stores cater weddings? But this is where it is. And then as far as the mission, again, I really do have a lot more to say on the topic, but I do think there is a mission to the world. I think what I would want to answer at the end of the day is like, where were you while the country burned down around you? I wouldn't want to say I was battening down the hatches. I would want to say that I didn't know whether we were going to win, but I certainly wasn't going to give up the fight. Remember, my belief is that the sexual revolution at some point, in different stages, spends its energy, right? At some point, the truth is real, and the truth will win in the long run. And the question is whether how much suffering needs to happen until people learn their lesson. Of course, when suffering happens in these cases, it's children who typically suffer the worst and the most. And so, whether it's experimentations with no-fault divorce that slowly are being rolled back, kind of all these things that are, some of the worst expressions of the sexual revolution that have done so much damage. People do learn their lesson, but the longer it takes people to learn the lesson, the more damage is done. And so I think we do have a responsibility to our fellow citizens to do our best to combat it, and not to say we'll protect ourselves and the culture will take care of itself, like you said.
I think I was 11 when that took place, so I actually don't know the details well enough to speak about it. Yeah, I would have to look at. I've never actually studied that incident. I would just say, in general, the way that religious liberty ought to work in the United States is that under the RFRA standard, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, is if the federal government is going to substantially burden the sincere exercise of religion, it needs to be for a compelling state purpose in the least restrictive way possible. And so what it sounds like you're saying is that there wasn't a compelling state interest. Besides, we think these people have a weird religion, and that it was a pretext that they're amassing guns was used as a pretext to attack a weird religion. If that's the case, then it should have been a failure under RFRA. There wasn't a compelling state purpose. It wasn't being pursued in the least restrictive way possible. But I just have to go back and actually look at what took place.
So that's a great question, and it does take us kind of pretty far afield from the religious liberty thing, but it's very much to the point. Probably too big to handle now, but I think it's also, I should say, and I should have said this at the time, maybe different for Jews and Christians, right? Because Christians do have an evangelical mission in a way that Jews don't, right? And I definitely take the David Novak line, for Jews, the obligation the rest of the world has is to be Noahides, right? To obey the 7 Noahide command, to believe in the one true God and keep what I see as basic natural law morality. So I think for the Christians, the advice I would give is to do a better job evangelizing, that the Christians should make the pagans Christian, as many as they can, as fast as they can. And I'm biased I know that I'm biased when I say that, because my experience is almost exclusively with American Christianity, which is by far the most benign and beneficent, version. But there's good Christianity in many places around the world, and I think that does need to spread. For Jews, I think it's a matter. I think really you were asking about internal education. I think that, and this will sound like I'm I'm just being paid to say this, but that's why I really believe in what Tikvah does. Tikvah, the Tikvah higher-ups aren't quite on board with the natural law project in the way that I am, and we tease each other about this a lot. And as I said, in the long run, the truth wins, so I'm not worried. But I think that the Jewish community needs to do a much better job explaining why we do the things we do, right? So we have this great tradition of laws that are rationally explicable or understandable or something like that, and ones that aren't. And I think that that while the Catholic Church over the last 2,000 years developed a very systematic philosophical and theological tradition, the Jews developed a very systematic legal tradition. And it is beautiful and wondrous and complex and intense and deep and magnificent. And so it's not to say anything against the rabbinic tradition at all, except to say that when we now find ourselves in a culture where all the assumptions that they could have taken for granted are no longer taken for granted, things like marriages between a man and a woman exclusively, that to continue to have these practices without explanation and understanding, without what I would say is the underlying natural law understanding, just sends kids adrift to college, and they hear terms like marriage equality and things like that, and say, well, nobody can be against equality. And so I think now how schools, on top of everything else they need to do, how can they do this too? So I don't have the answer to that except more Tikvah programs. But I could say that would be the beginning of my answer.
I know there's a couple of hands, but I just want to ask in this context how each of you think about Islam in America.
Among my Christian friends, there's kind of two camps, and I'm not sure whether the disagreement goes all the way down. But one camp is that, and as you know, Christians see Judaism and Islam in a very different way. In one camp, the Quran, the whole religion, is a satanic corruption of Scripture, and at the end of the day, I mean, of course there could be good Muslims, but at the end of the day, it's the fruit of the poison tree. And so there's only so far it can go. I think there's another camp that, and maybe they don't really disagree, but it's just more pragmatic, or maybe they disagree on the underlying theology, but I'm not sure, says at the end of the day, religious believers can and should bind together in alliance for all the things we believe, right? So religious Jews, Christians, and Muslims are all social conservatives, basically. And so what we don't have to worry about the theology. What we have to worry about is a political, legal, cultural alliance that will preserve the things that we need to raise families and build religious institutions, so on and so forth. And my inclination is very much toward, also as a Jew, I don't have to have the same theological view of Islam as Christianity does. But so maybe it's easier for me in that respect. And as you know, the rabbinic tradition, in some strains of the rabbinic tradition, actually see Islam more favorably than Christianity from a theological perspective, though it's mixed. So for my money, I'm inclined toward the pragmatic side and say, why wouldn't we work with anybody who wants to work with us, while at the same time being mindful, obviously, on the international scene, the Jewish community's relationship with Islam is very complicated, and so the politics are always dicey, but I'm happy to be a pragmatist about this.
So my thinking on this has been influenced by Dan Philpott. He's a professor at the University of Notre Dame, and he and I have collaborated together with some projects. And he gave a series of lectures at Princeton last year, and we published a version of them at Public Discourse, where he said, there are places both today and throughout human history in which religious liberty and Islam coexist. And that they have found resources within Islam itself to have Islam flourish while being respectful of the religious liberty of non-Muslims. And so what he argued is that in the US context, we don't want to be pushing for like to put this in a Christian context, a reformation, which was a radical break within the Christian tradition, a reformation, nor an enlightenment, which was a secularization of Christianity. We want what Catholics call a ressourcement, going back to the sources. And so his argument there was that Christians and Jews should be partnering with Muslims to find sources within their own tradition which can embrace human rights, the rule of law, and religious liberty. Apart from converting them to the one true church, which, as a Christian would be our ultimate evangelical goal here. It would be neither to say you need a reformation, which would be a rupture, nor an enlightenment, which would be, from their perspective, secularizing, watering down the faith, but find seeds within their religious tradition itself that respects human rights and religious liberty in particular. And it strikes me that that's what I want to be doing with American Muslims, finding ways to partner with them where we can, where they can be promoting their own version of Islam that's compatible with human rights. I read a really nice article titled "Who's on Which Side of the Lunch Counter?" And it was by a law professor in California saying the segregated lunch counter was in which the majority powerful white was preventing blacks from sitting on an equal basis. And he said, today, the baker, the florist, the photographer, who is in the position of power and who's actually in the position of being marginalized? And if you look, this month being Pride Month, which Fortune 500 company is not having a Pride event, does not have a rainbow flag, is not kind of on the side of a non-Judeo-Christian understanding of human sexuality and of marriage and of the family? In which case, what's the justification for the government imposing the viewpoint of the majority on religious minorities, whether it's a Catholic minority, an evangelical minority, a Jewish minority? It does seem somewhat gratuitous, especially on college campuses. Which viewpoint is better represented on campus? What goes by the label marriage equality or the traditional Jewish Christian understanding of marriage? So if the rhetoric that was being used by the left actually was taken seriously, it would come down on Danielle and my side of these debates. But I think it's largely a cloak. This is where I'm a postmodernist, right? I mean, I think this is language being a cloak for power. And then at the end of the day, the social justice language and the equality language that is frequently used is being used as a cloak for an outcome. And so I don't think that that rhetoric is going to, on its own, kind of change the tide in our favor. I'll say something quickly, is that I don't think the court would ever explicitly overturn Yoder or Pierce. And I think that the way that the states would try to do this would be that, yes, you can go to a religious school. Yes, religious schools can be open, but you can't go to a discriminatory school. And they're going to define an Orthodox religious belief as discrimination, and that's going to be the hook. And the same thing, I think we're probably somewhere 5 to 10 years away from parents having a child removed from their custody because raising the child within their religious tradition, and not kind of anything extreme, I just mean like mainstream Jewish and Christian upbringing, with a child that has gender dysphoria, for example, and the parents don't want the child to take puberty-blocking drugs. I think we're probably 5 to 10 years out from a Child Protective Services removing the child from their custody. And it might be less. I might be optimistic in saying it's 5 to 10 years. Because I don't think that they would want to give up the principle of, yes, religious schools, we're fine with that, provided it's the right type of religious school. So I don't think it would be a frontal assault of, no, we're shutting down religious schools. It would be, no, what we want, if you're a liberal Christian, if you're a liberal Jew, a Reformed Jew, your schools are fine. We're not targeting religion, we're targeting bigotry.
Reformed Jewish school.
Right.
Hilarious.
I don't even know if they exist, right? They might be called public schools. I don't know.
Well, yeah, that's exactly part of the problem with this, right? So once the law, if the government established that promoting same-sex marriage as part of the public policy, that's part of the legal public policy of the United States, then they could. But right, all the pieces are already there in a way. Now we're not so far gone. There still is part of, I think, why Ryan's right that it won't be a frontal assault on religious institutions in those cases is because there's still enough in the culture that protects religion and religious freedom and that sort of thing. I don't know how long it will last, but there's still enough. And that you see, right? I mean, the way the progressive movement is so far ahead of the general culture, and that's why not one necessarily. And that's why up until really some of the later, well, really in the end, it was mostly done through the courts and not done through legislatures. There are some exceptions, but mostly through the courts to change marriage law, for example, because there weren't voting majorities in most places for that. And so, so I think that I think I'm getting away from answering what you were asking, but I mean that's where I think things are for now. Yeah.
Let me say two things really quickly. One would be laws that combat racism are good because racism is bad. Laws that combat Judeo-Christian beliefs about human sexuality are not good. They're bad laws because Judeo-Christian beliefs about human sexuality are true. So there's a structural difference in the situation. The second comment is that there's also a practical difference. The condition of African Americans in the United States throughout race-based slavery and then race-based Jim Crow, and I would argue even up to today, is drastically different than the condition of gay and lesbian Americans today. So in addition to racism being wrong, it was such a pernicious and pervasive wrong, and it was doing so much harm to people that there was an overriding government need to combat racism. Today, I don't think Jewish and Christian beliefs about human sexuality are wrong. And even if I did, I don't think that the status of gays and lesbians in the United States is comparable to the status of African Americans. And so I don't think the legal response that was appropriate to combat racism would be appropriate to combat homophobia. So those are two, I think, very significant differences.
And the first point Brian's first point just goes back to the idea that at the end it's not actually just about arguing for religious freedom, but for religion, because at the end of the day, what we actually have to do on some level, cultural, political, legal, whatever, make the substantive argument in favor of the thing we're actually asking for the freedom to do. We're not asking for freedom to be racist. That's substantively different than the freedom to live out Jewish or Christian values, right? Those are, and because one of them is right and one of them is wrong, and that's the only thing that's going to sustain it in the end, because the legal regime, perhaps reasonably, has decided there's no right to do a wrong.
I would say we want to decline from having to draw that line wherever possible. And so what I mean by that, the default in the United States is a condition of liberty. And it's only where liberty is somehow failing to promote the common good that we have government come in and regulate. So I would say as much as possible, we want to leave these things to freedom, to market interactions, to voluntary associations. And only when that doesn't work out do we then have to say, all right, here's the need for a regulation. So if there is a town in which an essential service is being systematically denied to a customer on the basis of some arbitrary basis, then we would need anti-discrimination statutes. So if there were hospitals that were saying we won't do chemotherapy because you're gay or lesbian, or if there were restaurants that said we won't serve you a meal because you're gay or lesbian, then we might need to see anti-discrimination laws that include sexual orientation that are drawn narrowly to apply in those contexts, but not in the context of sex reassignment surgery or adoption agencies or wedding ceremonies. But as far as I can tell, we're not seeing discrimination of that sort. Right? The only examples that either side of this debate can really point to are the baker, the florist, the photographer, marriage counselors, a Kentucky T-shirt printer who was asked to print gay pride parade T-shirts, adoption agencies, and then sex reassignment surgery. Apart from those specific instances, there haven't even been reports. Memories Pizzeria, the example Danielle pointed to. So I would say until we actually have a problem that needs to be addressed, I would say leave it to freedom. That's how we deal with most of American disagreements. We don't kind of anticipate a problem and come up with a government solution before the problem has actually arisen. Because you're right, it's hard to, in the abstract, say, well, how much is too much and where would we draw the line? And that's why free exchange, free association frequently can avoid the necessity of drawing tough lines. I think we need both. So I think we need both sets of arguments, because I'll put it this way. I think religions that I think are wrong also have religious liberty rights. And I think that's true, because I think the nature of religious liberty, the human right to religious liberty, is that each and every one of us has to seek out God and answer those existential questions for ourselves. You can't answer religious questions for me. I can't answer religious questions for you, and the state shouldn't be answering them for any of us. And so we all have freedom to do this. But in addition, where a particular religious belief comes under attack as being bigoted or discriminatory, it won't be enough just to say religious liberty. We'll also have to defend the substantive viewpoint that we seek to hold. Because otherwise, I think what happened to Bob Jones University will happen to Jews and Christians. Because Bob Jones University was a religious institution that had a racist belief. And they said exactly what you said: religious liberty, we have a right to have our wrong belief. And the government and the majority of citizens said, no, racism is so wrong and so evil that we're eradicating it. And so that's why I think Danielle and I are saying we need to argue both. Religious liberty is a human right because we each have to be accountable to God on our own, and so we need the space to live that out. But then also, this particular viewpoint that's coming under assault, it's not wrong.
And I'll pick up on that and add 2 footnotes, which is, first of all, associate myself with his remarks. And you can see this, I think, more clearly in practice. So in the middle of the 19th century, rather, there was a polygamy case that came before, Mormon polygamy. The Mormons don't practice polygamy now, but they did then. And there also, it's not even like the child sacrifice case, although there too, we could say, if the religion says, well, this is our thing, and we say, no, there's a fundamental wrong involved here that justifies. You can say religious liberty from here, till the cows come home, and it doesn't get you anywhere. And then, even in the case of polygamy, you could say that it's consensual participation. There's no harm being done to anyone. That's not our view of polygamy today, mostly in our culture, but still. And there's no way to resolve that and to distinguish it from something else without going down to, I think, the substantive argument of whether polygamy is justified morally, or whether we can make, again, what he would call a natural law argument against that sort of thing. 2 other things I think to keep in mind about this is, one, people like me, probably like us, are also a little bit, although, I mean, Ryan and the idea that to have courts come in and start making decisions about which religions are serious and aren't, and which beliefs are serious and aren't, that's a little bit, now legislatures maybe have more of a place to do that than courts. I'm not saying that nobody could do that, because then we have a total free-for-all. But we do, the idea that it would be resolved by proving to the court that you've got a real tradition. Judaism is many thousands of years old, it's several thousand years old, and the LDS Church is only a couple hundred years old, and so on. And I'm not sure we'd want to count them out for religious liberty purposes. And then the last thing, which gets to your heart, gets to the heart of your question in a way that I think that pushes back a little bit, is to remember that there really is no neutral position. There is no position that says, and this is kind of also goes back to the language about marriage equality, the idea that the other side will want to say is, well, all we're asking for is neutrality. It's not going to be there a neutral treatment of all groups. Now, every line that we draw, every decision that we make is going to instantiate some substantive judgment about which practices are right and which practices are wrong, which judgments are right, which judgments are wrong. And again, that's how we have the line between our regular marriage and polygamous marriage, and so on and so forth. There really isn't any neutral position, and so we can't get entirely away from the right, wrong, true, false, just in the name of liberty. That's not going to work all the way down.
My friends, I hope that last month you enjoyed our discussion of school choice. Next month, I hope you'll join us on July 26th when we hear about left, right, and the State of Israel, with Michael Duran of the Hudson Institute and Eric Cohen of the Tikvah Fund. But now, please join me in thanking Ryan Anderson and Danielle Mark.
Thank you.